tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Just coming out of this sharing, gratitude for all of the sharing, vulnerable speaking. I'll say a little bit more here on the Buddhist idea of Kamma as we might relate it to the experience of collectives, or I'll summarize some of what we were just discussing. One of the pieces that threaded through the conversation and is threaded through the framework of thinking about groups of people, collectives, as a kind of self, as a kind of identity, is the way that identity is formed by narrative and maintained by narrative. And this is true, of course, for individuals as well. When I say myself, right, setting aside the Buddha's analysis of what we call self and its emptiness, but when I just say colloquially myself, one of the things that I mean is the sum of the story that I hold to be true and identify with. And from a Buddhist perspective, the more rigidly I cling to that story that I identify with, the story that I define myself through or as or by, the more I'll suffer. Right? Because that story that defines me is also going to then define that which is not me. And so the story of me always includes the story of the other. And, you know, we fantasize about the other as the good friend or the ideal parent or the desired lover, but we can't have those desired and benevolent others without also living in a narrative that has the hated other, the feared other, right? The undesired other. So identity always comes with an other. And one of the things that liberation from a fixated identity in the Buddhist context brings is a radical destabilizing of the narrative that we have relied on of what is self and other. This is partly why monastics leave the family, right? Because the thing we call family is, you know, can be a wholesome construct, can be a very challenging construct, but one of the things that it does is it puts a border around a group of people and says, this is us, and then those that are not us are other. And some folks identify strongly with the family, some more weakly with the family, depending on your conditions. And this is true for entities at every layer of the fractal. So, you know, if you identify with a queer community, you might, if unconscious, you might reify ideas that the non-queer community is a kind of other, to be feared, to be hated, to be despised, to be ignored, you know, to be fetishized. This is true for any kind of community, right? If you're part of non-queer community, you might, you know, fear, hate, desire, fetishize queer community, right? There's always going to be a creation of other. One of the reflections that came through was about a kind of cultural heritage example. So like a group of people from a place or a nationality or an ethnic heritage that is in diaspora. And we were talking a bit about the Armenian diaspora coming after the Armenian genocide and the variety of responses that arise within a diasporic community to respond to their condition. And particularly in this present moment with genocide in Gaza, how being a member of a community that knows genocide in its collective history and consciousness can have a particular kind of relationship or response to another people undergoing genocide. And so we have, like one collective entity having a feeling and potential intentions and even actions to support, another collective entity undergoing genocide, right? We saw this, last year or so, or the year before, when, South Africa filed against the state of Israel in the International Criminal Court for apartheid, right? Essentially saying, we know apartheid when we see it, because we know it from the inside, and we know it when we see it, and we are now accusing, this other nation of this crime. And so thinking about how Kamma, which is, again, how intention and choices and actions, particularly those with strong ethical charge, positive or negative, harmful or helpful, has an impact over time, for others, but also for the one who does the action, who has the intention. Then we can see that just as with individuals, a hateful othering in the heart leading to hateful actions externally gives rise in the future to more hatred, right? To a further calcification of not just hatred, but the view of self and other that was behind the hatred, the fear. And so then, if this is true in an individual, we propose that it's true in the fractal, so that the same pattern is at play in a collective, right? There's something has happened to bring hatred and othering more strongly into the self-definition of a collective of people, a group of people. And based on that fear, hatred, history of trauma, there's a hatred that gets directed outward, and then choices are made and actions are taken. One of the things I think that's important to watch out for if we're theorizing on collective Kamma or generational Kamma or actions taken by a group of people is that it can run the risk of generalizing the blame, and it's important to not fall into this. Like at the moment, a lot of people are, being very careful not to say, the Jewish people broadly are perpetrating a genocide, but to be more precise and say the current Israeli government is perpetrating a genocide. Because of course, and just last week, there was that enormous protest in Israel, and there have been protests all along and growing, demanding that their own government not do this and, allow aid to get through. And, so there are some ways where a collective has a kind of entity to it, a kind of communal self that makes choices. And at the same time, any collective, is a wildly differentiated bundle of selves, that many of which can be very opposed to what's happening, right? The large collective of the United States, looks like, a scary fascist place to some people right now in the world. But of course, there's all sorts of people who are, loving and kind and doing everything we can to not become a fascist state. I was listening to this Japanese comedian recently who had a whole bit about Japanese people. She was saying, like any Japanese person in America is not there willingly. This isn't, small print. This is not necessarily my view. This is the view of a sharp-tongued Japanese comedian. So blame them for this if you don't like the joke, but she was saying, any Japanese person in the United States is not here willingly. I mean, who would willingly leave Japan like, oh, it's clean and it's quiet and it's peaceful and there's free healthcare, and you come over here? And she was like, yeah, the United States is the escape room of countries. So there could be this perception elsewhere in the world that like, this is really terrible. And but of course, it's a wildly diverse place with, that can't be summed up into that one experience. And at the same time, that you can zoom way out and you can say, oh, there are features to the American experience that we can identify as being personality traits over time. A generalized desire for, freedom, and self-determination that sometimes gets super toxic and sometimes is really great and is complex, but that there's a kind of personality, right? And so as we think about collective Kamma, we can also think then about what are the ways that trauma particularly is passed down, generation to generation within a large group of people. So, every person of Armenian descent that I know, all of my friends who have that background, at some point in our friendship, we've talked about the genocide. Right? All of my friends who are Jewish with any is this true? Almost all of my friends who are Jewish, pretty much, at some point, we've talked about Gaza and Palestine and the war, right? And the Holocaust at some point. But also, so much beyond trauma that's present, in the intersections of our lives and our interests. But there's always present in any interaction. I think this is partly what we can feel into with practice, that you can feel the fractal of identities present. So whenever I'm engaging with a person of any, definition, I can tune my perception to their identity at any of these levels, right? I was just at a friend's birthday party who's a queer man, Jewish, and there was some conversation and sort of energy around the war in Israel and Gaza. Right now, there was also some energy around queerness and some energy around being middle-aged and aging, and there were layers there. And I very consciously, not intentionally, but I was aware, just as I was there, of the ways that my perception of this person and the people there kept shifting frames, right? That like in 1 minute I'm being with my friend who's having a birthday, and just celebrating them as an individual on their birthday. And then at another, in another moment, I'm in a room that's filled with, almost entirely people I know identify as queer or gay. And then at a different point, I'm aware of, the Jewishness and non-Jewish ratio in the room. And particularly as we're talking about this, and my friend has this identity. And so I'm, and then I'm aware of, the flickerings of, political identity, racial identity, all of these layers. And each of those layers comes with karmic force, right? I can feel the force pressing upon the expression of queerness and gayness in the room, and how that identity has been shaped by its history, right? And how the different ways that folks are manifesting their queerness, I can feel it in cultural context, right? I know that's partly just being culturally fluent, right? Like, what is it to have gaydar? You know, it's like, well, I have it because, you know, I came of age in San Francisco, and I know gayness when I feel it. Like, whatever. That's true in so many ways that we perceive layers of identity, layers of then, karmic force pressing forward. And sometimes what we can perceive in the foreground is the trauma, right? Particularly when that trauma has been stirred up or is active. I remember right after, choose your calamity, but like at the moment I'm remembering right after the shooting in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, and that my perception of the karma of gayness was, um, brought into the foreground of awareness, right? And it's heightened, and there's a certain awareness of what it means to be gay or queer adjacent, or, an ally in various ways, depending on who you are, or disconnected from this. And you can feel it happen. So I think where this is going is that there's a practice that we can hold where we there can perceive intentionally the way that every being is nested in layers of belonging, and all of those layers have histories, have traumas, have privileges, have karmic force shot through them, and that as we manifest our identities in relationship, we are always manifesting different layers of this all the time. And different layers come out at different times, all the way out to the species layer. When all the humans on my land leave and it's just me and the puppy, and I'm engaged in this cross-species love affair with my puppy, who is divine, really. And you would think so if you met her, I know. I can particularly feel, like the karmic legacy I carry as a human and the karmic legacy I perceive her carrying as a dog. And um, and uh, and so this is true at all of the levels. As we sense this, then I think we have the opportunity to do with our various collectives and relationally with each other what we attempt to do with ourselves in practice, which is to feel the force of our own kamma pressing upon us, our past actions and the past experiences that we bear, inflicted upon us by others, blessed upon us by others, how it affects our state in the present. As a member of a collective, or as the entity of a collective, we have the opportunity to, the traditional language would be purify that kamma. We do it by feeling it and by making a different choice. Right? So the way that kamma is perpetuated is we feel a force from the past that has identity and othering in it, and we are unable to make a different choice. So we feel the, hatred coming from the past, and we reproduce that hatred in the present unconsciously, or even being aware of it and saying, like, I can't help it, right? I can't avoid this feeling, or I can't undo this feeling. What practice urges us toward is first to restrain our outward actions, so ethics, right, to at least not perpetuate the harm, but then layering toward the internal to begin to work on the feeling itself, and to say, this feeling of hatred or othering, violent othering that I feel is, I've inherited this. This is, this is not directly about me as an individual. This is actually coming from a collective mind. And I can participate in the healing of the collective by shifting this feeling in myself, but also coming together with others in my collective to shift this feeling, right? So when members of a whole class of people, whether that's, Armenians in diaspora or American Jews or Palestinians in diaspora throughout the world, any group that has some kind of cohesive identity that bears trauma from the past comes together to process that. The way that the Jewish population in diaspora has done so beautifully processing the Holocaust, in so many ways, in museums, in art, in communal gatherings, in ritual, in grieving. This is how a collective processes trauma. And there's clearly more to do. For any collective, if we can do the collective version of what we try to do in practice as individuals, we meet the feeling with whatever tools we have for processing it. And there come through it by feeling the impact that it's had and refusing to press that impact or allow that impact to carry forward into the future through our actions and our words. Right? So we say in some way, it stops here. Right? Or we do our best to say it stops here. Right? Never again. That's what that was all about. And it's hard work to do this. It's hard enough to do it as an individual, much less, convincing your family, your friends, your entire, global heritage to heal. But it happens, and it happens not through any individual's effort. It happens through collective evolution and effort and maturing. And it clearly does happen. So a question just came in at the end, and I'll just flow right into that here. How do we digest the momentum in a way that doesn't harm as much as possible? Yeah. In the same way that as an individual, I try to process past trauma by feeling its impact in a healthy, contained space, like in therapy or in good, safe friendship, or ritual. As a collective needs safe enough space to feel the hurt and process it without acting out. So I feel like you can really take anything we know that works for an individual and say, what's the exact parallel for that for a collective? What would be the parallel of, let's say, therapy for a collective? How could the entire body of a community, go into therapy? And we have to step back and be like, okay, what's happening? Right? It's not like everybody talk to one person. That would be mixing levels. But it's sort of like, how can everybody feel safe enough and met enough and held enough in relational space to come up with a more coherent narrative, a more integrated somatic experience of both their pain and their identity and their coherence in order to not further act upon the old patterns. So, it has to be done together because that's what the entity is that it's a collective entity. So collective actions then, right, someone's mentioning the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, exactly that kind of thing, right? And you see this broadly. I think of woke in the United States as a kind of collective attempt to heal some traumas of racism and othering and exclusion. And so, think about how a collective expresses itself. I've been thinking lately about like viral memes. What is a meme doing, right? that there are memes that are about forgiveness or self-love. What happens when all of TikTok explodes with memes about loving and accepting yourself, right? That's a kind of collective expression of a certain attempt at healing. It's the kind of thing that as an individual we might say to a dear friend or a therapist, but now 1 million people are saying it on TikTok, and it's being heard and amplified. And so then the collective is actually saying something. And so you can look for these expressions that are collective. Right. Someone is saying, taking refuge in the triple gem. I think a wholesome spiritual path that has a community like Buddhism, to the extent that it's wholesome, I think it largely is, with a few shadows, as all large institutions have. To the extent that it's a wholesome structure, something like the ritual of going for refuge, particularly in Sangha, that's a collective gesture. So yes, you do it for yourself. Individually, you go for refuge. But you know what it's like when you go to a big ritual and everybody does it, or if you remember, anytime that you're chanting a mantra, or going for refuge, that at this very moment, millions of people around the world are also doing that. That has a certain collective force, not just individual force. Right? That's a narrative that millions of people are telling and reinforcing moment after moment. And so when we join into that, we're not just joining into it as individuals, but we're actually amplifying that particular statement coming out of the collective. We're amplifying the voice of the collective saying that thing. All right, so make the best memes go viral. The memes of goodness and peace and forgiveness and righteousness and refuge. So, all right.